right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of our Scholar Spotlight series. I am thrilled and excited and so grateful to have Dr. J. Aaron Simmons back on our stage to talk about his book, Camping with Kierkegaard, Faithfulness as a Way of Life. Dr. Simmons, thank you so much for being here.
Oh my goodness. It is a pleasure to be back. Anytime I get to hang out with a philosophical drummer, like that is an easy ask as far as I'm concerned.
All right, all right. Wonderful, wonderful. We're going to have a more conversational style to this Scholar Spotlight presentation here. So, would you mind me just diving in with questions, or do you want to go ahead and kind of set the scene a little bit?
Well, I mean, maybe I can just say a couple things about why this book represents a kind of deviation from my other work, which my hunch is that people aren't super familiar with my other work, so this will not come as some great surprise to them. But I think this is my 12th book, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere in that neighborhood. And all of my other books have been written for academics from someone who was first and foremost and exclusively an academic as author. And so this book is neither of those things. It's written to a broad audience, trying to be as compelling and as inviting and as accessible as I can possibly make it for everybody. But it's at the same time, hopefully, still, doing philosophy with enough rigor that it's not ever patronizing or talking down to an audience or assuming that they are, as the popular series would say, a bunch of dummies, right? It's not philosophy for dummies. It's actually philosophy for where we find ourselves in the world. And more and more and more, as a result of the last 6-7 years in America, at least, the COVID pandemic globally, the continued fear and anxiety, and of course even this week, the horrific events going on there, Israel and Gaza. It's hard to think that the kind of philosophy that we academics are so well equipped to do can stay isolated in the academy. Because if that's where we are and that's where we stay, then it seems pretty unlikely that we're doing philosophy with that original Greek sense, which is to invite people to live a meaningful life, to understand philosophy as a kind of spiritual exercise, a kind of spiritual practice, whether or not one's religious, that we do philosophy with our bodies in societies, right? And so this book literally was written on top of mountains, outside of libraries. After getting off of my mountain bike or putting away my fly rod, I would sit down in a friend of mine had a cabin, and so I would sit at his cabin, or I would literally be on a bulge somewhere, that I could get just enough signal to get the computer to work. And it is personal without being a memoir. It's full of stories from my own life, but it is not meant to be a story about my life. It is, broadly speaking, anchored in my shift in awareness from being somebody who was oriented toward, I wouldn't say workaholism, but I might say careerism, where everything I did was sort of anchored in my career as sort of justifying what I did, why I did it. And what this book represents is an awareness that that approach misunderstands everything that existential philosophy offers. And so the two big ideas in the book are that we should fundamentally understand the single most important question in philosophy happens to be the most important question for beings like us who are flawed, fallible, and vulnerable. And that question is simply, what is worthy of our finitude? So the book asks that question, confronts us with that question, and then it does not answer it with specifics like, therefore, go to Walmart on a Tuesday, or you should major in philosophy, or go get a job at Chick-fil-A. What it does is says there's two fundamental orientations that we could take up in response to that question. One is what I call a success orientation, and the other is called a faithfulness orientation. And the basic difference is that a success orientation says we should think that our finitude is made worthy by checking a bunch of boxes, by doing more, by being able to let other people be jealous of our accomplishments. And what I suggest is that this is fundamentally empty. It misunderstands who we are as the kinds of relational beings that we are. And instead, I recommend faithfulness as a better alternative. And faithfulness is simply, I define risk with direction. So it is not religious, though it, of course, could be cashed out that way for people who identify with particular religions. But we all, following existential philosophy, risk ourselves in some direction. And we can do this in good faith, as Sartre suggests, where we are intentional and purposive, or we can do it in bad faith, which is where we deny that this is in fact really upon us, that this question of what's worthy of my finitude and which risk am I willing to take, and similarly, what direction do I think is, the purpose-driven life, as it were, right? But now purpose is not understood as a theological concept. Purpose understood as who is it you're becoming? Are you okay with who you're becoming? Are you okay with what it is people are likely to say about you, right? What is it that your tombstone's going to look like? And are you cool with that? And the idea is that we shift from a set of goals that can be checked off to a orientation, a way of life that certainly is logistically invested, right? We've got to be strategic. We've got to think about where we're going and how to get there. If you really want to be a professor, well, a doctorate's kind of a thing you go get, but getting a doctorate doesn't make you better. It doesn't give value to your life. It instead simply is a union card for doing the kind of things strategically that you think are worth doing. What really matters is what is it that you've been willing to become faithful to? And so these questions, I think, are better understood as becoming questions. So being faithful as a father or a husband or a professor are not things that I check off on a Tuesday. Man, I had a hell of a fathering win on that Tuesday, leave my son on Wednesday so I go out on top, right? The strategy of like exiting a millionaire internal to an entrepreneurial venture is fundamentally opposed to the way that existential faithfulness works. So the book is trying to invite people to understand faithfulness as a way of life without then trying to answer for them. So what then's worthy of your finitude? I don't know. Like you've got to figure that out yourself. We're all in different contexts with different passions, with different strengths, with different experiences. But all of us have the opportunity to be in good faith with our finite, vulnerable, and yet sociable lives. And so that's the hope of the book, the point of the book. I have been unbelievably impressed by the fact that people have found it worth reading, which is very different than anything else I have ever read, I've got to admit, or everything I've ever written. And so, 18-year-olds are telling me this is great. It's helping them figure out how to kind of go forward in their lives and navigate college. And I'm hearing this from 50-year-old CEOs who have been super successful and feel empty and trying to figure out how to rethink their lives. And then also 75-year-olds. I had a woman tell me recently that this book helped her realize that her life was not over and she still had plenty of faith left to live into, right? So I figure if anything is really valuable in it, it's not me. It's the fact that Kierkegaard and Sartre and Beauvoir and Kendrick Lamar and Donovan Woods and all the people, the kind of cloud of witnesses upon which I draw, have been saying really smart stuff for a very long time. And maybe putting all that together with a little bit of mountain biking and trout fishing and camping metaphors and analogies is connecting with people. And that really excites me. And I hope that it hits your audience with some benefit as well.
Amen. Amen. Now, I have a tendency to just steamroll people. So I like to, as a practice, just open up the floor to other questions before I go about. Nathan, would you like to ask away?
No, I thought that was a really great elevator summary.
Well, thank you. It's a long elevator.
Yeah, exactly.
I admit, like that. It's a tall building.
It's a Willy Wonka elevator.
That's exactly right. And I apologize. I had to close my windows. I was realizing that this wonderful night here in South Carolina, as beautiful and cool as it is also mosquito filled. And so as I was like, man, I am getting mosquito bites. So I shut my windows to anybody watching. What in the world was he doing? That's what that is. So.
Well, we're just eat up with excitement over here. Don't, and hopefully not in a way that'll suck you dry. Sorry.
Yeah. So maybe to help lead the conversation. So one thing that you often hear a lot of in especially the the discourse in French existentialism after the Second World War is this idea of bad faith. And in the way it's cashed out is different. For Sartre, it's much more abstract, maybe kind of vaguely Marxist. For Beauvoir, takes it in a more feminist direction. Fanon, obviously, in post-colonial action. But they never really define what good faith is. What does it mean to have faith in a way which is authentic or allows people to pursue authentic life projects? So could you talk about how the existentialist movement thought of bad faith, why they didn't necessarily talk that much about good faith, or at least how can we draw upon the resources within that tradition in order to kind of move in this more affirmative direction that you talk about in your book?
Yeah, no, this is a really good question. So I think bad faith is easier to talk about because it's, telling people what we can tell is not a good idea, right? Telling them what a good idea looks like is super complicated for especially the technical existentialists. So here I'm thinking, 20th century, primarily French, though also some German voices as well. When they start talking about what we should do, it's tricky because now it can look very much like that they are positioning themselves as moral authorities in some sort of non-perspectival way. And Sartre in particular, though I think Beauvoir is a better philosopher, Sartre, I think sometimes gives better examples. And so it's probably because, his speaking engagements were a little bit more broad. And so he gives this great example very famously of basically a student coming to him and saying, hey, I want to live in good faith effectively. And so should I go off and fight for France or should I stay and care for my ailing mother? And Sartre's response is basically, well, do whatever it is that yields the life you're okay having lived. And you can see why the student is sort of annoyed by this answer. And all of my own students, when they say things like, hey, Dr. Simmons, do you mind if I skip class on Tuesday? I've got this other thing going on. I want to make sure it's okay. And my response always is, freedom's real, so are consequences. Like, I refuse to take away the decision that must mark your life. Now, whether or not to come to my class is a little teeny stakes decision, right? Like, who cares? They should almost always skip it and do whatever it is that's calling their attention elsewhere. But when it comes to things like, with whom should I partner for my life? What should I do for a career or a calling? How do I understand virtue to be something I can live into? What even counts as the good? These are questions that the existentialists are touchy about because they are so committed to three things. And these are, in my opinion, the three hallmarks of existential thought as a specific movement. Number one, the death of God is the birth of our responsibility. In other words, whether theist, atheist, or something else, the fundamental realization is you have to decide what will have meaning and what won't. So even if there's a God, even if God tells us what matters, you've got to decide to invest yourself in that narrative as true, such that it's going to be activated in your life. So responsibility, hermeneutics, interpretation, these are on your shoulders, regardless of your training, regardless of your background, regardless of your circumstances. Number two, that agency goes all the way down. In other words, even if you are socially without all kinds of freedoms. I mean, my goodness, right now, we're seeing a very complicated situation going on in Israel and Gaza. And although there's nothing that could justify the horrific acts of Hamas, there's still plenty of moral outrage, for decades at the lack of freedom given to Palestinians. And so we could talk, and this is true, for all kinds of marginalized, historically excluded communities, right? And yet what existentialism wants to say is the fact that there lacks a social or political freedom calls us to work for justice. But it never strips away existential freedom. Your agency is still engaged. And this is the kind of thing that we see at the end of The Stranger in Camus, right? Where Marceau's, walking up the scaffold, basically. and he gets to decide whether or not he's okay with the world. Like that question, he can't run away, he can't escape. It's not up to him what his next moves are, but it's fundamentally up to him how he navigates it. This is what Nietzsche will call a yes saying in the face of what often seems a fatalist circumstance. And so if we understand that agency goes all the way down, hermeneutics, responsibility is always required. This leads then to number 3, which is morality is always ambiguous. And this is drawn straight from Simone de Beauvoir. So if morality is ambiguous, that means there's precious little that is obvious when it comes to the good. Now, we want to say, my goodness, white supremacy is obviously wrong. Well, yes, right? Like I have nothing in me that wants to make that complicated and nuanced. But now, as soon as we go beyond this abstraction and say, but how do you navigate living a world where the people who marched in Charlottesville, and I would say in radical evil doing so, are the next day the attorneys or physicians or Walmart employees or Amazon drivers? Now you've got a more complicated, again, morally ambiguous scenario. How do you navigate a world in the context of evil ideas? Well, they're always held by people, and people are complicated, and people are free. And the only way we're likely to draw people out of those evil ideas is probably to somehow find ways to continue to recognize their personhood, which is sucky because they often don't recognize the personhood of the people we love, right? So those 3 layers are fundamental to existentialism. And this is why good faith, which I'm defining again, risk with direction is faith. The question is, are you doing this on purpose? Are you choosing to own that you get to decide how to see things? And that even if things suck, it's up to you to say, like Jay-Z will often comment, but baby, I'm good. Like in the face of horror, can we somehow call it evil, live toward justice in light of that evil, but recognize the fragility of the conception of justice depends on our living toward it? And that's really hard. And so I think one of the reasons that in this book, at least, that I try to direct our attention to faith is to pull the word back from an exclusively religious context. Though I identify personally as religious, and I'm happy to give talks about this that swing that direction, that is not where the book lands, right? That's one of those options for good faith. But similarly, man, there's a lot of religious people of faith, quote unquote, living in bad faith. And that's where I want to suggest that thinking of it at this existential level makes us really good at understanding the weight of our critique and also the importance of not taking away decisions from the very people we're trying to empower. And unfortunately, I think this is a little footnote, the left, where I identify, tends to be especially bad at that, right? Where we want moral clarity so bad that we end up eliminating the very option for how to be faithful and say the only way that we will engage you is if you agree with us on X, Y, or Z. And I think that existentialism, as much as we want the kind of leftist politics that might show up there, there's reasons that Sartre broke with the Marxists. And there's reasons that Beauvoir was really hesitant to be involved with any of these kind of big social campaigns. There's reasons why Simone Weil, who deeply religious, refused to join the Catholic Church. Like there's all of that complexity. And that's the stuff that I'm trying in this book, not to talk about in a historical way, but in a personal way. We all face this. How then should we go forward? Faithfully. But I don't know how that then looks for you. And that's the point, right?
Is there anything you want to add? That was a very illustrative answer.
I'm wondering about the potential irony involved in pointing out evil, acting in such a way that we might instantiate justice, and recognizing this fragility. Like, oh my goodness, what sort of irony is in our action, in our thought, in our becoming, in addressing evil and the like.
Yeah. It's important. If we are not going to become people who advocate that the solution to false dichotomies are just better dichotomies, right? I want to say, no, the solution to false dichotomies might be that there are rarely dichotomies, right? And life is rarely going to break down in those simple sorts of ways. And yet notice the emphasis on nuance, which again, this book tries so hard to invite nuance in our lives, but without requiring us to go get PhDs and learn Danish and German, right? The idea is sometimes we think nuance is the kind of thing that then gets wrapped up in this really bizarre critique of elitism that gets, targeted towards intellectuals. And what I'm trying to say is, no, nuance is something all of us have to navigate when we, my goodness, speak at school board meetings during COVID, which I did. And I can't just get up and say what I want to say, because I've also got to recognize the audience to whom I'm saying it, right, is not exactly receptive to the 4-step modal proof that I have for why they should do this. And so sometimes it can become difficult for those of us who make thinking deeply and inviting nuance a habit. Sometimes that can, I think, blind us to the actual difficulty of talking to other humans. And it turns out that if the existentialists are right, and especially if the sort of existential phenomenologists are right, and so I do draw a lot on Emmanuel Levinas and Jean-Louis Chrétien and others in the book that are similar. Kierkegaard has strains of this as well. They're saying that fundamentally our lives are defined by responsibility. And that responsibility, though, immediately throws us into a challenge. Because if, Kelly, you're the only person who exists, well, it's easy. I just do everything I can for you. Full stop. Problem is, dang it, Nathan, you effed up my ability to be good and moral toward Kelly, because now do I just give each of you 50% of my time? Do I give Kelly 60 and you 40? Is it the case that I just ignore you and say, he doesn't matter? Like, notice immediately I've got to start making decisions about how to live, given that there are always more than one way to do it. And that's always going to be, again, ironic, paradoxical, difficult, especially for people who kind of identify themselves socially as, standing for the kind of moral vision. And I certainly hope we do that, right? I want to stand against racism and against sexism and against homophobia and on and on and on. But I also recognize that sometimes doing that work might mean, that I have to model what humility looks like and hospitality looks like. And dang it, Derrida, you jerk, absolute hospitality? Come on, man. So I don't get to choose who not to invite in? And his answer is nope. Like, they all get invited. And only when they come in can you start doing the difficult work of figuring out then who gets what bedroom, right? And that sucks because we love feeling morally self-righteous. And for what it's worth, I think it's important that we be able to have a sense of justice that does allow us confidence in living. But confidence is never certainty. Faithfulness is never a guarantee. And becoming will always fall short of success if you want to put it on trophies. And so, we've got to rethink how we assess our lives, how we celebrate each other, what it is that we start looking for as signals of a life well lived. And that's what this book's trying to do, is invite us to rethink some of that. And as the rapper Bus Driver says, we can make it better. And then he follows up, but we're not, right? And it's that, but we're not, that this book is trying to kind of get us to be aware of so we can figure out what better might be.
Yeah, we have an excellent question in the chat. Victoria asks, does your book discuss, or do you have thoughts on, what happens when your faith is broken or lost, and how one might rediscover faith?
Oh, wow. Victoria, so Thank you. Thank you. As Anne Lamott says, I discuss her a lot in the book. It's important to understand that faith is not only with direction, which is how I'm understanding it, but it can also be understood in more pedestrian or mundane ways. And I say that not to downplay them, but instead, as Kierkegaard says, the knight of faith is the one who finds the sublime in the pedestrian. And so if we think about these other kind of lived ways of making sense of faith, this can be religious, right? And you've got I'm giving a keynote talk next week called Ethics After Deconstruction. And what I mean by deconstruction is like Derridian technical stuff. What the conference I'm giving a talk at means, it's the Theology Beer Camp out in Missouri. They understand deconstruction as people who have lost their faith and are now rethinking what their faith journey might look like or how to understand it. So deconstructed faith for them is explicitly religious, but in the context of a religious idea that has now been rejected or no longer is possible. So the same could be understood. Faith also can be a synonym for trust. What happens when we lose trust in someone or something? How then do we live on purpose in light of lost trust? So it's important to understand that faith as this risk with direction category can then play out in all these very specific ways. And that's, I think, Victoria, maybe what you're getting at. And how do we live faithfully in light of that loss, in light of that, trust that has been broken, in light of faith that no longer seems plausible or even possible, or to be honest, my goodness, sometimes just seems vicious. I will tell you what I am planning to tell the big audience next week, which is we find ways to then anchor ourselves in the virtues that model what we wish we would see from others. And those three virtues for me, I've already talked about two of them, but they are humility, hospitality, and then gratitude. And believe me, there are many days, like Kelly and I were talking before the recording started, you don't want to do any of those things, right? You want to be mad at freaking Facebook because they're kicking you off their platform. You want to be mad at Amazon, A, for just being, jackasses, and B, for not getting you the order that you need in order to go on your book tour. You can be super, super angry at the fact that a very few people in the world continue to cause suffering on unbelievable scales for so very many others. There's plenty to be so angry about. And yet, in addition, not instead of, right, but and also, wow, like if we're not remembering that humility calls us to realize that whatever we deem worthy of our worship, it probably shouldn't be ourselves, right? Like at some basic level, egoism, narcissism, arrogance, what my buddy Aaron James calls assholery, these are not things to cultivate. And so when we lose faith, it might be because we had faith in an institution or an organization or people who turned out to be assholes. And finding ways to live non-asshole-ish is, I think, actually a kind of rediscovery of faithfulness on the other side of that loss. Hospitality is realizing even if some voices are no longer going to be part of the way we navigate the world, sometimes we do have to recognize, even though morality is ambiguous, that person's not. Like, I have to no longer be in contact with that person. I think for what it's worth, again, like a lot of my friends, this is not my area, but a lot of my friends are just war theorists, in ethics. And, they'll talk very deeply about the difference between combatants and then the radical moral requirement of non-combatant immunity. And being able to differentiate between who is enemy, as Chantal Mouffe would talk about in a discursive setting, and who is just an agonistic protagonist, right? Somebody who actually motivates me to rethink. That's somebody we should be very hospitable to. And so the fact that we can recognize enemies does not happen on the front side. It's what happens again after living into that absolute hospitality. Eventually, there still, says Derrida, their decisions are going to have to be made about who gets to stay, right? And this is hard work. And then finally, gratitude. The idea here is, and I think this is the hardest one for what it's worth, because there's just so many reasons not to be grateful, not to be, pie in the sky. My goodness, ain't things wonderful? There's a lot of reasons to think, no, it's effed up. And yet, I think unless we find ways to say, as another theologian that I referenced in the book, Wendy Farley, also a good friend of mine, says, unless we find a way still to discover beauty, we've allowed something to win that only we can stand against. It's what the civil rights preacher William Barber will talk about when he says that the whole point of the Easter story is that you can't hold a body down, right? And there's something about that is just agonizingly beautiful. It's what James Cone calls hope beyond tragedy. And being grateful that is even possible, even if it seems so difficult on a given day. I think, Victoria, if we can somehow find ways to cultivate humility, model hospitality, and then even when it is hard, find moments of gratitude, it conditions what I call in the book joy ultimately. And that doesn't mean happiness right now, doesn't mean silly pie in the sky wish fulfillment. It doesn't mean ignoring the reality of injustice. It does mean, however, that we still live a life toward which joy remains in front. It's what Derrida will call the democracy to come. Unless we anchor ourselves in that direction, then again, you can say this in this sort of William Barber sense, it's only with the hope of resurrection that the crucifixion names what it names, right? It's not defeat. It's actually an invitation to rethinking. James Cone says the same thing when he talks about the cross and the lynching tree. He says when we can identify this difficult, complicated history of white supremacy and say, man, internal to this, there's this unbelievable resource. It doesn't mean, therefore, Christianity is metaphysically true. It does mean we've got really interesting cultural resources and stories and archives upon which to draw for inspiration of how to live in situations that seem unlivable. And so, Victoria, I recognize that is not a here are your 3 steps and how to go do it, but hopefully those virtues can still be worthwhile, even in moments when it's hard to know how to get out of bed. But I think that maybe getting out of bed nonetheless is just a little bit more likely if we realize, hey, there are too many assholes. I'm not going to let them win. And man, there's too much insularity and narcissism. Watch what welcome looks like in my life today. And though the earth is scorched, damn, like there's a flower coming up in the ashes. Somehow those moments can still shine through. And this is what Kierkegaard, I think, teaches us in what he calls the lessons learned from the lilies and the birds. He takes us into the outdoors and actually talks about what the lilies and the birds teach us. And I think these are those lessons. So, Victoria, I hope that helps. If it doesn't, please respond. Give me a different angle that maybe we can think this through together.
Well, she says beautiful answer, and I would agree. And speaking of beauty, we're all about that at the LCP Foundation. Our whole mission is built on axioms of beauty. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the role that beauty plays in maybe clearing the way for humility, hospitality, and gratitude, or I don't know. You mentioned what is worthy of our finitude, and maybe the play between our finitude and infinitude. How does beauty come into play here?
Yeah, so it's a cool question. Again, if anybody really wants to dig into a beautiful account of beauty, go check out Wendy Farley's book, Beguiled by Beauty. It's amazing. She is a queer feminist Christian theologian. wrote an endorsement for the book. I thank her very much for that. We kind of traded endorsements. I endorsed her Beguiled by Beauty when it came out a couple years ago. But for me, and this is again more philosophical, she's a theologian. I am not. And this book is not a religious book, though there are certainly moments that try to unpack the way I make sense of God, because I think that that is a word that does a lot of work for us wherever we find ourselves. And so I try to give at least one model of how to think that through in a little bit more existentially compelling way in one chapter. But for me, beauty invites these three virtues, I think, in two ways. One, beauty is itself deeply ambiguous. So it would be in philosophy, it is part of what we call value theory. And so in value theory, the two big categories are aesthetics, questions of beauty, and ethics, questions of the good. So it's not just that the existentialists say the good is, ethics is ambiguous. Its values are. I mean, my goodness, this is why Nietzsche says we've got to revalue all our values. This is why Kierkegaard, in many ways, says that religion is beyond or on the other side or even suspends ethics, which is just a complicated way of saying our ethics don't get to be as universal as we think when it comes to the subjective task of living in light of it, right? And so beauty, when we recognize that it's ambiguous, that then also throws us back into what I think is really profound. And again, it's not my view. It's just allowing their views to be seen. Is the world beautiful? Wendy Farley wants to say yes, like we discover its beauty. I want to say possibly, right? Like, are you living such that you are cultivating what Aaron James would call adaptive attunement? So are we engaging in practices that attune us to find beauty in the world? And for me, the more time I spend in the mountains, the more likely I am to see the world as a beautiful place. Not just because, oh my goodness, it's so beautiful, though that's the kind of words I use. It's today, I went mountain biking with my son. And it was amazing because all the leaves have started falling here in South Carolina. So we're going up and down these hills and around the trails. It's all covered with leaves that have fallen. And at one spot, we stopped, he climbed up the hill, and we're kind of looking down the trail. And I was like, man, I said, my son's Atticus. I was like, Atticus, like, isn't this just beautiful? And it was one of those moments where the fact that we had gotten out of what Wordsworth would say are the din in towns and cities, we got out of that to occasion the moment where I could comment on leaves, right? What does that look like in our lives? Are we finding ways to create opportunities for joy such that beauty shows up for us? This might be, my goodness, sitting in the car for an extra minute and a half before walking into work and letting that awesome song we're listening to finish, right? Like, the world's just better if it doesn't solve justice issues, but the world's better. It's more beautiful because, like today, I was listening to J. Roddy Walston and The Business, a band that I like a lot. I actually taught Rod Walston drums when he was like 12 years old. And so I'm listening to him, and I'm like, man, like, they have this song called Brave Man's Death. And I was like, this song rocks. And it rocks because what it's saying is, I want to die a brave man's death. And you're like, yes, that's what faithfulness and becoming is all about. And the fact that they put this into such emotion and lyrical brilliance, and also a hell of a lot of energy, it's like, I'm going to let that song finish, then I'll go take care of grading papers or whatever I got to do. So it's not that we find beauty in the world, it's that we put ourselves in positions such that beauty becomes more likely to be something we start attuning to, right? We see it, we develop it. But then secondly, beauty functions to facilitate humility, hospitality, and gratitude when we start flipping the script, or Kendrick Lamar would call it, we pimp the system, when we start rethinking what beauty looks like. So, for example, the success narrative, sadly, tends to understand beauty as almost always something that is made available or made more likely because of wealth, because of status, because of privilege. philosophy almost always says, well, but the little like inch big turtle my son found today while out biking, and he picks up and he's like, Dad, don't you love turtles? Right? It's like, you know what? Yes. I mean, there's some privilege that I didn't have to work today. We were able to get to the mountains, like it was his fall break. So I recognize it's not privilege free, but the idea was just finding that turtle was a moment where I was able to say, shoot, like, keep your Tesla, give me turtles. You know, like it's turtles all the way down, like that, you know, famous idea. Maybe that's a kind of way of rethinking what counts as beautiful. Couldn't we redefine this? Let's rethink how this works. And so if we recognize that beauty is ambiguous, and so therefore put ourselves in positions to cultivate an attunement so that we can start seeing it in spaces where others don't, and two, realize that what others call beauty sometimes can distort for us the world to such a degree that it becomes really ugly unless we are really privileged. I think both of those would be the kind of ways that beauty can function for us. And that's why the stories I tell in this book are in many ways personal attempts to describe what I find beautiful. But my wife thinks camping is dumb. Why would I want to go sleep with spiders? There are snakes. This is so dumb. For her, why are we not at the beach? Like, she has a very different sense of beauty. And so it's fine that we differ on this. And the point is, are we creating spaces where we can live toward it? That's what I'm trying to invite us all to recognize is possible, regardless of our privilege, regardless of our circumstances. But then we realize, but it's easier when privilege is there. Maybe we should work hard to get rid of the injustice that then privileges some bodies at the expense of others. Like, that moral, social implication certainly follows. But what I'm trying to do in this book is kind of the existential ground clearing work to make us understand why then it's so important to live into that justice, rather than thinking all we do is be critical and justice isn't here yet. And I think that what it's doing is actually making us just angry and making us hate people. And we're doing exactly what Sartre said we shouldn't. We're focusing on all of the dark in life rather than being able to say, there's a lot of light if we develop the eyes to see it. And then we now have reason to fight against the dark. Right. And so I don't know if that's helpful, but those are the two ways I would understand beauty.
In the name of beauty, and then I'll stop dominating the questions here. May I read a poem? This is Maggie Smith, and I love this poem anyways, but it's so timely because I'm taking a class right now, and our professor, Professor Goldthwait, shout out to you, assigned this as well. I'm like, this is so timely. So this is Maggie Smith, Good Bones. Life is short, though I keep this from my children. Life is short, and I've shortened mine in 1,000 delicious, ill-advised ways. 1,000 deliciously ill-advised ways I'll keep from my children. The world is at least 50% terrible, and that's a conservative estimate, though I keep this from my children. For every bird, there is a stone thrown at a bird. For every loved child, a child broken, bagged, sunk in a lake. Life is short, and the world is at least half terrible, and for every kind stranger, there is one who would break you. Though I keep this from my children, I'm trying to sell them the world. Any decent realtor walking you through a real shithole chirps on about good bones. This place could be beautiful, right? You could make this place beautiful. That's it. Well, interlude. Thank you. Thank you all.
That is fantastic. And two quick thoughts. One sounds very similar to the beginning of Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, where he gives these 4 different versions of how to kind of poetically, midrashically interpret the relationship between Isaac and Abraham post this horrible scene. And each one ends with this kind of, the mother blackens its breast in order to blah, blah, blah. And the idea is, but I keep this from my children, is a way of saying, hey, I'll do everything I can to narrate the world in a way that actually might be out of step with how difficult I find it. because only then does it invite my kids to live into a world that looks like the one I know is possible. And then the second thought is, I love at the end, but you could make it beautiful. One of the highest compliments my dad said he ever got is that he's been told that any place he's ever lived was better when he left than when he got there. And the idea of, are we, and this is a Heideggerian idea, right? Are we dwelling in the world? Are we actually poetically dwelling in the world? That's just a version of what I'm calling faithfulness. Absolutely.
Wonderful. And thank you for entertaining that.
You mentioned, your work is just kind of a foregrounding, but trying to reorient ourselves to the ambiguity that comes with subjectivity. And you don't necessarily think that we can, at least in your project, necessarily go from the first order attempt to sort of understand existential situations to these more second order concerns about values and the good. What would you say to somebody, maybe someone who believes in a kind of thick normativity, who does want a strong sense of, like, this is how we ought to respond to the world, not necessarily to eliminate nuance and complexity, but does think, no, there is a good which orients all other kinds of goods. I think Paul Tillich's definition of, I think it was religion or God, was the matter of ultimate concern, the concern which sort of nestled all other concerns that we have. What would you say to a person like that, who is one who recognizes, like, yes, the world is filled with nuance and ambiguity, but I want clarity. Do you think that those two projects could be complementary?
Yeah, not clarity. So I'm going to push back on that one. Yeah. Not that you were suggesting it's a good idea, right? But if there's anybody who says I want clarity, no, I'm going to suggest that we want confidence, but not certainty. That should be the way we understand this. That we want forward momentum, but clarity almost always serves to blind us in other ways. And this is, again, a Heideggerian sense where the unconcealed always functions to conceal. And so if we realize whatever looks perfectly clear, I'm probably missing something, right? That I'm cool with. But the idea of it's just clear, boom, that makes me worry. And I'll give you two examples. One, Martin Luther famously says, "Here I stand, I can do no other," right? Which sounds like the kind of paradigm case of moral clarity, right? I side with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who says, we can always do otherwise. That fact sucks, right? This is what Sartre says. It's disturbing that God is dead. And again, I say this as still somebody who identifies as a theist. The death of God doesn't mean atheism's true. It means theism and atheism, or again, lots of other varieties, become options for us. How then will you live? Right. And the way that I would then narrate this, and this is sort of the second move, is to say we should all, and I recommend this in the preface. I'm going to read you a little passage from the preface, but David Foster Wallace's "This Is Water." Everyone, as soon as they are done watching this, then they should hopefully go either to Amazon or bookshop.org and buy a copy of my book. I would really appreciate it. And then third, immediately go to YouTube and watch This Is Water, right? Like, listen to all of it. Because in there, Wallace says the following. And again, this is me quoting him, but it's in Camping with Kierkegaard. "In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. An outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, you'll never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your body, beauty, sexual allure. You'll always feel ugly. And when old age starts showing, you'll die a million deaths before they finally plant you." So what is it that Wallace is doing? I think he's actually tapping into this kind of Tillichian notion of ultimate concern. And so I absolutely want to say we've all got to decide not just what's worthy of our finitude, but what's worthy of our worship. Where is it we tap real significance, real value, real orientation? And that, we might call that a kind of moral realism. I identify as a moral realist. So despite my existentialist proclivities, I still think that the good, ambiguous though it is in all lived contexts, is not something that is so radically ambivalent and ambiguous that we would say, well, like with Richard Rorty, white supremacy, racism, look, it's up to us. What are we going to decide? I want to say no, like white supremacy is evil. But how we then live against it and how we then navigate people who have been raised in those evil ideologies, well, that's a complicated question. And the sheer difference that we've got an example of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and the criminal industrial complex that we've got in America show there are different ways to navigate dealing with people who are not adhering to the way we understand certain types of social norms, right? And I can say, well, I think our prison system in America is itself a kind of evil and does a kind of injustice. But then what do we do as an alternative? Now we're back to that ambiguity, right? So I think if we are claiming confidence about what's worthy of my worship, and for me, I might say, Derrida gives us an idea of justice as worthy of our worship. That seems like a good idea, but his notion of justice is not very specified, right? Like, then it's going to be complicated. Martin Luther King says equality and human dignity, worthy of our worship. But how does that work out? Well, it's not just going to be a race issue. It's going to be a class issue. And it's also going to be something we've got to figure out how we then navigate the people who are now seemingly disadvantaged by trying to equalize how advantage gets distributed, right? It's always going to be something that challenges any claims to certainty. So I would say, yes, it is important that we find an anchor. I call that what we worship. You can call it God. But I don't think that God is ever something that confronts us with the kind of certainty that you find in lots of churches who will use phrases like, the Bible is clear, right? It is perfectly clear that.
Right.
Those are the kinds of statements that make me itch and start squirming. But I do want to say I am a moral realist. I don't want to say that the good is just personal whim or social options. Which good we live toward depends on our social decisions. But I am still going to be a metaphysical and ethical realist. I'm just an existentialist and a deconstructionist and a postmodernist relative to how we relate to those claims.
I think that makes sense. It actually reminds me of a scene in Spielberg's Lincoln, where Lincoln's talking, I think, to Thaddeus Stevens, and it's about the effort to ratify the 13th Amendment and abolish slavery, and the complicated political logistics to do so. And it goes, a compass I learned when I was serving, it'll point you true north from where you're standing, but it's got no advice about the swamps and the deserts and the chasms that you'll encounter along the way. If in pursuit of your destination you plunge ahead, heedless of the obstacles, achieve nothing more than sink in a swamp, what's the use of knowing true north? So I think that kind of gets to your point that
that's fantastic.
Like there might be a metaphysical good, but hey, they're swamps, they're deserts, they're chasms. How do you navigate those?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I had a student recently. I gave a talk about Camping with Kierkegaard actually here at my own university, and the students, a lot of what came into this book has been developed without any intention of it becoming a book, but it's been developed in my class laboratories for the last decade. And I kept thinking the whole time I was writing it, but could this be something that like an intro to philosophy class could read? And and not only that, like, what about an intro to philosophy class that sometimes you have colleagues and stuff who will teach these in prisons or with homeless communities or, in different contexts. What about a church small group, right? So I kept thinking that intro student as my audience, and then letting the philosophy class spill to all these other spaces rather than just, the kinds of elite students that tend to people fancy private schools like I teach at, right? And this student came up to me and he said, look, I'm so on board with faithfulness. This makes tons of sense, but how do I do it? And I said, well, let's chat, man. Like, what do you think's worth doing? And then let's talk strategic, right? So my point is, you tell me what you think's worthwhile, and then we'll talk strategy, because I think what you're asking is strategy. So if you really, 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 like we all hear from students, I want to help people. Okay. Do you want to help people by giving them shoes? Do you want to help people by curing their gout? Right? Do you want to help people by finding them houses? Like, what do you mean by help people? You want to help people by creating an app that none of us knew we actually needed, but now can't live without. Like, what do you mean by help? And once you kind of invite them to start owning their own orientations, then we can talk about, okay, you really want to help people by becoming a teacher. Like, you see that as the way that you let your strengths hit the needs of the world. Well, what level of teaching? You want to do K-12? Let's go talk to the education department, right? So I tend to think that the way we navigate swamps is to realize you can't navigate a swamp unless you know there's a swamp in front of you. And all I'm trying to do in this book is say, oh, there's gonna be swamps, but I don't know when they'll show up. And I am pretty sure that there's also going to be some cliffs. And the way you navigate a swamp is definitely not the way you navigate a cliff. There's probably going to be some sugar sand, and sugar sand's going to be very different than red clay, right? So even though we can have this kind of toolkit existentially for recognizing this is going to come, how do we prepare ourselves? It's only when we then face that situation that we figure out on the ground how then to be strategic and move forward. And sometimes, which every hiker knows, you got to go back a little bit. You got to walk around to get to the actual crossing. The bridge that you thought was there got washed away by the storm, right? Carry some rope. So being able to draw on these metaphors in the woods helped me think about the kinds of lives that we inevitably live.
Right. It actually really complements Charles Taylor's discussion of moral phenomenology, source of the setup, when he talked about how we exist in this moral space, and there's an up, down, left, right, and there is this qualitative evaluation of everything. And you could read that as him being, an extreme ethical rationalist. But I think your approach, which is more grand existentialism, is like, well, actually, there's a lot, like, if you ask me, how do you get to San Francisco? Well, there are a lot of different routes. There are a lot of different boarding times. And you have to kind of figure that out. Even if you know the direction, it's out west, not much help.
Well, and this is, you were right to say earlier that part of what I'm trying to do is get us to focus on the inescapable reality of subjectivity as the starting point, which again is one of Sartre's definitions of existentialism. And, how do you get to San Francisco? Well, like, it should be probably a really important question. Are you in Tokyo or Nashville? Right? Because it turns out, like,
there's so many songs about going to San Francisco. You think they would tell you how
how do you get there? Go west. Well, unless you're in New Zealand, that's a long freaking flight, right? You should probably go east. So being able to understand where we are allows us to make sense of where we think is worth going. And a lot of people, I think, get really, really nervous about living because they think that decisions, again, like I mentioned, my students want me to take away their decisions so they don't have to own the consequences. We think that decisions close down possibilities. The problem is it's true that the longer you live, as the skater Rodney Mullen, a guy I'm really a fan of, he says that eventually we fall towards what we find ourselves doing The hope is that in the end of the day, we're not insufferable beings, right? So we fall forward towards what we're doing. And as we make decisions about what to do, we are shaping where we're likely to keep going. The point is, almost no decision is irreversible, right? I mean, my goodness, 10% or so of people are working in their college majors. It doesn't mean majors are unimportant. It just means it's probably not the life determining decision you think it is, right? I mean, a lot of people end up selling their house and moving because they realize that wasn't really where we wanted to be. Doesn't mean that buying a house isn't something that you should think long and hard about, but it doesn't mean that you're stuck now, right? The Money Pit movie with Tom Hanks and Shelley Long, we're not stuck. Like, we've got options. And so being able to remind ourselves that we have options. Yes, we're going to, as we move forward, the decisions will start, becoming more and more and more attuned to that set of realities, but it's not like we're stuck here. And not being stuck, man, that is something far too many people, I think, live their lives. What Coleridge said, quiet desperation, right? We live quietly despairing the fact that we feel stuck. And sometimes we are stuck that I've got a mortgage I can't pay if I quit my job. Well, I'm stuck in my job for a minute, right? But maybe I need to get out of this mortgage. I mean, realizing there are other ways forward. I mean, no one would ever get unlost in the mountains if they didn't learn how to go backwards and then go forwards differently. And too many of us feel like, well, I'm lost. I guess I'll sit down here, know where I can go. It's like, no, it turns out there are literally an unlimited number of ways you could go. But sometimes the best thing is to sit down and wait for somebody to come help you. But that's a decision just as much as moving forward or going left or going right. But we want to narrate it as that's the only option. You're like, no, you're choosing it. And so choose it on purpose. Admit, be humble. You might mess it up. Risk is real. Things may not turn out the way you want. If it doesn't, well, just do it differently next time. Like that possibility is actually really empowering, I think.
Really, that was a great answer, by the way. I like how it all kind of congeals together. And the other thing I was just thinking about, just with the camping theme, is I'm just wondering the experience of nature. You really start seeing that almost as a form of worship, or at least as a sanctuary of like almost religious awe. You start seeing that really begin with the 19th century Romanticism, even in the American conservation movement, like John Muir, could be described as like a nature worshiper. And the idea of the sublime, untrampled wilderness. Obviously, there's some problematic stuff with that kind of description, but leaving that aside, that does allows us the kind of get outside of our buffered selves, the experience of awe to sort of to allow us to become more porous and experience and have a more static kind of contact with the world. How does that? I mean, as a guy who hikes a lot, who wrote most of this book on a mountain, where does the experience of like the awe and sublimity of nature come into your sort of existential phenomenology?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. So Anne Lamott, somebody I mentioned earlier, says that her 3 favorite prayers are help me, thank you, wow. Right. And it turns out I once gave a paper where I was using these 3 prayers as a kind of phenomenology of religious experience. And a very famous philosopher, somebody I'm very indebted to, named Merrill Westphal, was in the audience. And Merrill raises his hand, and of course, when someone of that stature raises his hand, you kind of always are just like, crap. Like, what have I stepped in? What thing have I not done correctly? I had the same experience once when Richard Rorty heard me give a talk, and he was the first hand that went up, and it's just like, crap, So Merrill raises his hand, and his response was, Aaron, I love Anne Lamott. I love the prayers, help me, thank you. I just don't get the wow. it seems that the world is just not one where wow is something that we are not just able to say, but actually saying is in many ways almost a sign that we're not paying attention, right? Now, wow, not in the sense of, wow, oh my goodness, that's horrifying, but wow in the sense of awe, the sense that you're describing. And my response to Merrill is, I think, the response that this book also tries to offer, which is, one of the things that is so cool about going literally into the mountains, but again, somebody else could go to the beach, or my goodness, you could have the same experience going into a preschool class, right? I mean, there's lots of spaces where what I would describe as the sublime confronts us. And it's anywhere, we can say it technically, anywhere where our intuition overruns, or our intention, right? It overruns what we are able to comprehend. So we take in more than we are capable of navigating. And again, think about this, right? The look on the face of a child, the feeling I had the first time I ever saw the Pietà in Rome. There's a lot of moments like that where I feel like my body is inadequate to comprehend that which I am confronted with. Jean-Luc Marion would call this the saturated phenomenon. But in a less technical sense, the sublime is simply those moments that cause us to step back and say, man, there's more here than it seems, right? And that more, going back to David Foster Wallace, he tells this great story about these two guys in Alaska. They're at a bar, and one is a theist, the other's an atheist, and they're talking to each other. And the atheist says to the theist, look, it's not like I haven't tried this prayer and God thing. I did. Once I was out in the wilderness, I was doomed. I was going to die. There was no way to get out of it. And so I admit it. There in the middle of the ice, I looked up and said, God, if there is a God, please get me out of here. And the theist looks at the atheist and says, so surely then you must be a theist, because here you are. And the atheist looks back and says, no, you are a total simp. All that happened is that some Eskimos happened along right at that minute and saved me, right? And at the end of the book, Wallace says, when we understand how to think differently about the world, to appreciate the world, we might start to allow for the possibility that the Eskimos are more than they seem. He doesn't say that there is a God, that Christianity is true, right? He's not going to that determinate certainty level. He's simply saying, are we the kind of people who live with a closed vision of what's possible? Or are we the kind of people that say there's probably more? I don't know what that more is fully, but I want to live in a world where plenitude and excess are part of it. And for me, man, it is hard not to see excess when you go into the mountains and you are, standing in the middle of a whitewater stream trying to land a brown trout, or you're on your mountain bike looking down a rock drop thinking, I don't know about this one. Or simply on top of one of these bulges writing a book, and you just stop and you're like, man, there is no word I can put on this page that is anywhere adequate to what I am actively looking at while trying to write it. And that just awareness of more is, I think, where the sublime confronts us. And that's where I think the wow shows up. And I mean, my goodness, even singer, I guess, rapper, I don't know what you would call him, but Post Malone, who I am not a fan of, has a song simply called Wow. And what he does is says, I'm rolling bands of Hundies, I'm rolling up in my G-Wagon, I got everybody saying wow. And what I want to suggest is that is the success model of wow. Look how much I got. People are saying wow because they wish they were me. The faithfulness wow is the sublime. It's the wow that says, man, who the heck do I think I am to think I've got all this figured out? Right. And that doesn't wreck me, but it does wreck my sense of self-sufficiency. And when Muir says the mountains are calling and I must go, my response is, I have a whole chapter about this, the mountains are calling, so will I hear this as a call? Right? Like, it's a question of, so how then will I inhabit the world? It's not obviously a call. It's a call when I respond to it and take it up and say sublimity will be part of my life because I want the wow to be activated.
All right. You heard here, folks. Post Malone is a crypto Burkean.
That's exactly right.
I wonder where I would fall in my response to his wow going, wow. Is that of faithfulness or is that of success or some sort of strange thing in between?
Well, I mean, Aristotle says that philosophy begins in Tamat Zain, right? The wonder of the world. And my son found that little turtle today. My son's 14, so the world is not full of wonder for him. It is full of bullies and YouTube shorts and unbelievable frustration because his hair's not doing exactly what everybody else says it should do, right? And yet he found this turtle. And just to say, Dad, aren't you glad there's turtles? I mean, like the sense that there was still a wow. I am sure it's possible he could have had one of those wow moments staying home this morning, but I think it's less likely. And so when I say the mountains in the book and camping, all of this is a metaphor. It is, but it's not meant to be non-literal, right? It's also got a kind of, like, even if you live in a concrete jungle, there's probably a way to walk around, your apartment complex and say, let's see if we can find, a leaf today. For me, it might be, let's find the biggest leaf, or let's find the reddest leaf because there's so many of them. For somebody else, maybe it's just, hey, what does it look like if we go to the park down the street? Are there clovers? Like the ability to invite each other to, like the lilies and the birds, learn that joy is still possible despite the fact that storms and winds blow and that our nests might get destroyed. It's what I discovered. I said, wow, when in the middle of COVID, which was horrifying and terrifying and anxiety inducing, Italians leaned out of their windows and sang with each other. Like, that's a wow. That's there's more here. And that's something I want to celebrate and say, let's do more often. Let's sing that together.
Yes. It's also interesting. I didn't mean to cut you off, Kelly. But in the early months of the pandemic, as just horrific as they were, there were these almost spontaneous outbursts of joy and solidarity. It was unfortunate that they were very brief. We get fatigued very quickly, but it does show that when we're put in a very extreme circumstances, there's almost an instinct to find beauty, to find joy, to find meaning, even in these really adverse situations.
Well, Havel, Václav Havel talks about this in Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl, I'm saying the wrong name. Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning, where Frankl talks about some needed to find hope in order to survive. Others had to get rid of hope in order to survive. But nonetheless, he talks about moments where wherever you landed, we sometimes would sit, he says, and somebody would say something and spontaneous laughter would break out. And it was this solidarity of laughing in the face of tragedy, which, my goodness, that's what Sisyphus does, according to Camus, which is why Camus says that when he raises rocks, he spites the gods. Like, the fact that that's something available, even when you think there's nothing you can do, what's your rock, right? And Camus goes on to say the rock is his thing. As long as he's got his rock, he has purpose. And therefore, when it ends, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. I tell my students that it doesn't say, therefore, it's rational to find him happy. It's we must, because if we don't find him happy, we're screwed, right? Because all of us are pushing some rock up a hill that's going to roll down interminably infinitely and always. So can you in that moment say, but baby, I'm good? Like, is there a way to say that and then say, and you know what? Maybe if we work together, we could actually push this rock way quicker and piss the gods off even more, right? Like, there are so many options for solidarity, for finding dignity in the face of tragedy. And sadly, the enemy of my book is the asshole. Like, that's the model of the success-driven narcissist egoist who denies vulnerability and denies relationality. Assholes almost always will make the world revolve around them, and therefore make the world less good for so very many others. So how is it we can not let them define what is true? It seems to me that rejecting their value theory is a pretty good first step. Screw success, right? Though we still can attain things and do things and be strategic, screw that value theory. Faithfulness is a different way forward. We can make things better.
Can we make room for the sarcastic wow without becoming assholes?
That's such a good question. Yeah, I mean, so Simon Critchley has a really cool book called Infinitely Demanding, where he says that we've gotten to a point in society where often the most profound social engagement comes in the form of a kind of farce. Slavoj Žižek has a book where he talks about, first as farce, or first as tragedy, then as farce. And the idea being that sarcasm, wit, a kind of provocative cajoling even can be at some level a kind of tool. So I'll give you an example, which now that I am full professor with tenure and stuff is kind of an example that is only available on the backside of these things. Excuse me. I was once told by a review committee that I was not going to get, promoted or whatever the issue was at the time. That basically they were doing the review that year and said, well, we've got concerns and, we don't think this. And they said, we don't think you bring enough gravity, enough gravitas to the classroom. We don't think you have enough gravitas for the philosophy classroom. And I thought, well, what kind of reason would you have for this? And the response was, well, your teaching evaluations are too high. And I was like, so you want my evaluations to be lower? And they're like, no, but there's no way that your evaluations can be this high. And you also publish so much, you also get so much done that it's impossible to do both of this well. So you must just be, flighty and, kind of sarcastic in your classes. The students just kind of think you're cool. Therefore, you're not really doing what real professors do. And again, I was very offended by this and also very frightened because this was early in my career. It was like, oh my goodness, I still got to get good reviews. I've still got to get tenure. This was a very concerning issue. So what I did, which I recognize was sarcastic or whatever the right word would be, I went and bought a shirt that just said gravitas and started wearing it to classes. And I was like, well, now have I got enough gravitas now? Right. And the idea here was I wasn't like punching people, right? That's not going to get anything done. But the ability to kind of make in some levels, right? You don't make a joke of human tragedy, but there's so much in life that's not tragic, but is just kind of dumb and stupid and annoying. And maybe there's ways for that to become a kind of moment of sarcastic critique, where, oh, wow, okay, I don't have enough gravitas. Selfie. Now do I? Like, there's a way in which Critchley talks about the Red Clown Army, where they would, storm capitals of different places and stuff as if they were this army taking over, but they were all dressed as clowns and they would have like squirt guns to squirt police and stuff, right? And you're like, well, I'm pretty sure that this isn't going to be a worldwide revolution, but there's something really profound in that action. And the same is true. Like, why is it that, my generation grew up watching Jon Stewart as the single most important commenter on the world. And the fact that he did it so profoundly funny is part of why it worked. right? So I think, yes, there's room for sarcasm. There better be, or I'm in a lot of trouble, right?
It's a way of flicking them away without
Yeah, it's important, again, not to become the asshole that you are trying to overcome, but I don't think having a good sense of humor, finding wit, being able to be clever in moments where that's appropriate, I think that's just also part of understanding that, maybe I'll put it this way, far too many adults, quote unquote, understand professionalism as just a euphemistic name for being boring and sad, right? And it turns out these are not synonyms. You can be a consummate professional and have energy and fun and not take yourself too seriously. Like, all of that's possible in this world. And for what it's worth, the very best philosophers I've ever met, the very best musicians I've ever met, the very best in a space almost always are the last ones to take themselves really seriously. It's the mid-managers who need to make sure you see how good they are. Like, the real administrators, like, if they're really doing it well, like, that crowd's like, nah, this ain't about me. Let's be good at this. Let's have some fun. Let's find ways to actually encourage each other. I'm not threatened by your excellence. And this is what Aristotle cultivates.
I was about to say, can we take this back to the Aristotelian cultivation of judgment that we see when we align that greater becoming, that greater end, with sort of these lesser, more strategic ends that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, to me, I would just say amen to that. The idea of camping with Kierkegaard is not, again, literally to take Soren into a tent with you, which sounds pretty miserable. Like, anybody who knows much about Soren Kierkegaard, like, that's a horrible idea. Going anywhere with Kierkegaard, to be honest, is probably a bad idea. Like, the guy was generally a melancholic human who, when I think Kierkegaard, this is a horrible thing to say. I was the former president of the Kierkegaard Society, and I have spent my life thinking through Kierkegaardian philosophy and celebrating what he offers us. But I kind of do think that this guy wasn't a person you'd really want to be around. Like, you remember the old SNL skit, Debbie Downer, right? It's just like, they're all sitting around. Oh, I did a great night. Well, I don't know. I mean, remember, we're all going to die tomorrow. Like, the fact that is probably what Kierkegaard himself was probably like. And again, there's a lot of stories and different takes on his life, but I don't encourage people literally to go camping with Soren. What I want to do is say camping with Kierkegaard is a reminder that you don't have an unlimited amount of time, so make the most of the time you got. And life is therefore, by definition, too short not to find some fun along the way. And so I don't talk enough about fun in the book. I talk a lot about joy. But what I'm trying to do is model having fun, and modeling having fun doesn't mean that we're just at comedy clubs. Modeling having fun is also like, being on the river with my dad, or going camping with my wife, or taking my son, fishing. And even if we get mad at each other about whatever, if he's not listening and I'm worried he's going to hurt himself, you know what? We spent that day together, and that was infinitely worth my time that day. So fun doesn't have to be ha-ha. Fun can just be purposive living into a space. And I'll tell you, like, when I go mountain biking, which is my absolute addictive passion these days, I go mountain biking with these 4 other people who were really, really close. And when we ride together and things get really gnarly and really sketchy, and you might start slipping on the bike, or you might start going the right, the response is to giggle. Like, and we even have this sort of joke amongst, like, is this a good trail? It's like, oh yeah, that's one you're going to giggle down the whole way. And what that means is it's going to scare the ever-loving hell out of you. And yet it's not so dangerous that you're likely to die, but there's going to be some hairy moments. And the fact that you ride out of them, it's almost like it rises up and you can't help it. You start giggling and laughing and then hooting and hollering, and you get to the bottom and you fist bump each other. And the idea that, hey, you know what? We're still here. And I'm not making light of the fact that thousands aren't in light of the last couple of days. What I'm suggesting is we've got to find a way to stop that kind of violent nonsense and that kind of assholery and that kind of living. And maybe one way to do it is to giggle with each other on the trails of life and fist bump at the bottom, right? Like that's also possible. And that's what I'm trying to advocate and invite people into.
Would you go as far as saying that the origin of reason itself is a sort of playfulness?
Wow. I hope so. I think ultimately, I mean, because I don't have a view of reason that is like this Enlightenment sense of capital R, objectivist sense. I don't have a view of reason like the Stoics do, where it's this like infinite, eternal good that is somehow providentially invested in everything turning out for the best. My view of reason is it is a discursive practice because we live in a shared world, and it matters that we have ways of thinking with each other that are appropriately structured such that truth, goodness, and beauty can become legitimate goals. And Derrida certainly would suggest that the only way we can do that together is if we allow for the play of our engagements to sort of overflow our intention. So it's like I've never thought of it this way, but it's basically an inverted sublime, right? Where the sublime is we take in more than we can handle, more than our comprehension is capable of. Play is basically the opposite. It's where we're somehow giving out more than we even could intend, right? It's the giggle that we can't quite contain. And yeah, this will be probably too religious for some, but I think, again, philosophy should always be personal, though not confessional. I identify as a Pentecostal Christian, and part of what that means to me is I simply affirm the possibility that if we are in some sort of relationship to the divine, that relationship's probably going to overflow our bodily comportment, right? And my thought is basically like anyone who meets Beyonce, apparently like something happened. She has this, I don't know if it's a virus or what, that makes people's legs go jelly and they fall to the ground when they get near her. It's weird. The Beatles seem to have this as well. Like scientists should study this thing, right? If the fact is we can't meet our favorite musician without babbling and like not even speaking correctly and our bodies shaking, how much more of the divine? So part of my being Pentecostal is actually just this sense that play is maybe part of who God is, and it ruptures our ability to think that we as rational agents can control everything. So reason as discursive practice is an upsurge of our attempt to say there's more, but we've got to do the best we can to get a handle on some, right?
So to go back to what you said at the beginning, doing philosophy with our bodies, can you say a little bit more about this bodily comportment and play and being receptive to the more?
Yeah. So here, the best thing I can do is suggest people also go read Aaron James's book, Surfing with Sartre, which I admit the only thing I didn't like about this title was that it might look to some as derivative, because there's already a hiking with Nietzsche, a surfing with Sartre, a backpacking with the saints. And I was like, this isn't like a genre book. And mine is so different than what those folks are doing. But I couldn't get away from the alliteration, and it just seemed quick. And any other title sounded like a Simon Sinek self-help book that would make me kind of throw up in my mouth. But Surfing with Sartre is awesome. And what James talks about there, what Aaron does, is he says, this adaptive attunement is basically a bodily comportment to the fact that the world is always changing faster than we are likely to be able to navigate. And so think of surfing, right? The only way you can surf appropriately, and I would say mountain biking just as much, you have to move with the waves or with the terrain, with the bike, quicker than you are able to process. Right. It's kind of like when we avoid, a car accident or something. It's often not because we see something happening and we go into slow motion and we think through, like, what was that Sherlock Holmes movie with Robert Downey Jr., where he could see like 4 different possible outcomes of which punch he throws first and how Moriarty's going to respond. That's not how we work. we work such that we sometimes respond faster than we can process. And if we understand our bodily comportment then to be a kind of mixture of Aristotelian habit, how are we developing and cultivating practical wisdom, navigating the world in ways that are likely to foster joy, foster play, foster gratitude, humility, and hospitality? These habits get functionally developed only if we are also actively invested in putting ourselves in situations to cultivate the bodily praxis of it. You're not going to get better at free throws unless you go to the basketball court, right? I told my son today, he was mad going up a hill. This little friend we were riding with, one of his friends, was faster than him. Like, Atticus, your friend rides like 2 times a week, man. This is the first time you've ridden in 6 months. Like, though you can process, I want to be better at this, the only way to get better is to go get on a bike. As a drummer, we can both talk. Like, my son plays drums as well. And so he gets real mad at me when he's like, Dad, help me on this part, or whatever. And I was like, okay, like what we're doing here is a ratamacue or a flamadiddle or whatever. Man, we can't do these unless we slow down. Let's just do double strokes for a week. And my son's response is, screw that noise. I'm just going to do this measure over and over. I was like, you're not going to get better at it, right? Like, the only way is to back up and put yourself in a position such that that thing that's hard becomes easier, because you realize that you had to make your body accustomed to doing that move. And I think that's true with thinking well, with living for justice, finding kindness, and also mountain biking and drumming, right?
I this summer, preparing for band camp, had a rudiment of the week, and my little drummers made fun of me so much until those rudiments showed up in the music and they couldn't play it. I'm like, if y'all, or as you said, slow it down. Let's slow the metronome down. And what did they do? They play it at tempo. And then if the band needs to adjust their tempo, they're all over the place.
Nope, that's exactly right.
Not to be smearing my drum line. I love them. They've
no. It's no one ever thinks that practice is the point. And that's good, because if all we did was practice, none of us would ever want to keep playing. But it's really important not to forget that unless we practice, we don't ever play. Like, the condition of playing is that I've put the hours in on the backside. I mean, I've talked about this before, but like, I got to the point where I was playing professionally, 3, 4, 5 nights a week for a lot of years. And I had 30 students every week I was teaching. And, being a session drummer, you're showing up at studios and there's a check on the music stand and a sight read chart, right? And it's like, all right, you are not going to waste the time of this studio because somebody's paying for it. And if you cost them money, like in many cases, not only will you maybe have to pay them back for the time, you're certainly not going to get hired for the next gig. But the only way I was good enough to show up and play is because I had years, and my son doesn't get this. I had years of 6 to 8 hours of practice. And what I say in the book, I actually talk about practice. I say, excellent people are faithful people, are people who practice and practice and practice because they realize there's always better that we can get. People who are success driven are that's good enough, right? Like, I'm out, give me the money. And you're like, well, you might be good enough for that gig, but I'm not trusting you enough to hire you for the next one, because now I need somebody who can walk in and rock with 7/8 grooves, or, I don't know if your chops are good enough to flip from a bluegrass session over here to a fusion session. And so the ability to be embodied and adaptive is actually part of, I think, how we navigate practice as the cultivation of a kind of virtue. Absolutely.
Could you say a little bit more about the ability to unify your practice to manifest in those different genres, in these different contexts? How can we make more concrete that analogy to faithfulness writ large?
Yeah, so let's go back to the trails, right? When you hike, the only way you're going to get strong enough to hike black diamond trails instead of blue trails is by hiking a lot of blue trails and starting to mix in some black ones, right? Like it's only because you have done enough to make the risk visible as possible, right? I remember when I first started mountain biking, I went to this state park near my house called Paris Mountain State Park. It's in Travelers Rest, South Carolina. And I would go there and look at these trails. And I remember like palpably thinking, well, that's just not rideable. Like that's not a thing bikes can do. It turns out that now, having ridden pretty regularly for 3 years, no, it's a thing I couldn't do. And it's not just that I couldn't do, I shouldn't have done. Because if I went out there and was like, oh, that's not rideable, but I'm going to ride it, like I'd end up in the hospital. I'd have broken stuff. And it turns out that I did break some stuff. I ripped my AC joint. I broke some ribs. I mean, I've got more pictures of bloody shins and stuff than I can describe, right? And it's the case that only by getting back on the bike, only by saying the faithfulness is not, I'm going to ride that trail. I rode that trail. I'm done. Do you want to buy a bike? That's not how we do things. That's not faithfulness. That's a success model. Because now I get the big sticker. It's like people who, and this is fine, but it's like people who run a marathon so they can get the 26.2 sticker on the back of their SUV and then like sell their running shoes and never jog again. And you're like, well, I mean, I think that's fine actually as a kind of life goal in the bucket list. And like, that's all great. But as a way of life, that's a disaster, right? So the only way that we live faithfully is if we realize I can only do gnarlier stuff if I really kind of devote myself to doing stuff that I can do and continue to expand, continue to push. And this is why I actually have stickers and stuff that I sell when I go give talks about the book. And one of them just is my definition of faith. It just says risk plus direction at the bottom. But the image that's on the sticker is a double black diamond trail sign. And double black diamond are the hardest trails that there are. They're pro-level trails. And the idea is there are no green bunny trails in life, right? All of us are running black diamonds. The problem is we don't realize it. And when we don't realize it, that's when really bad stuff happens, hiking and biking and like that skiing, whatever it is, right? I mean, you shouldn't grab a surfboard your first time and say, ooh, 20-foot swells? Hell yes. Like that's a good way to drown. But when you start realizing you can drown in 2 inches of bathtub water, there are no non-double black trails. But there are different ways to walk the trail that we see. And the more that we cultivate, the more we practice, the more we attune, the gnarlier the trail can get, the more we can see, the more we can shoot, the more we can send. And so I have a chapter in here where I reflect on the phrase that mountain bikers do. They say, just send it. And it's a way of basically encouraging each other to do something that terrifies us. Just send it. But you never just send it blind. The people who send it roll up, they'll session a feature, they'll practice this for sometimes months. Their double strokes are hitting a skinny in their backyard, a little thing that they've built so they can practice balance. Then they'll go and it's all right, man, you've done the practice, you've done the work, you've developed your bodily balance and comportment. Now freaking send it. And what send it then is once you start on that elevated skinny, if you stop, if you get scared, you might die. So once you commit, freaking go. And the same is true in life, right? Today, my son's buddy, we were going down this super steep, it was a black diamond trail. My son's first black diamond. He was so proud of himself. I was super proud of him. We got to this one part and it's a super steep drop. It becomes like a V, and you get to the bottom and then it bounces right back up. And so you basically have to send it hard and then you pump into the bottom so that your front wheel doesn't get locked and throw you over the bars. And so I tell him how to do it. And I said, look, guys, I think I'd walk this if I were y'all. Like, there's just no reason to get hurt today. It's not impossible, but you're going to have to do it right. Like, either do it right and it's doable, but if you don't do it right, you're going to get hurt. And so my son's friend, who's 13, he starts walking his bike down. And because he's going to walk it. And I was like, that's a smart decision. You got to know when to hold them sometimes, right? So he gets about halfway down, and then the trail gets crazy steep about halfway down. And he looks there and he says, I think I'll ride it. And I was like, no. And before I could tell him not to, he tries to get on his bike. The problem is, as soon as he tried to get on his bike, the bike shot out from under him because he's so steep, right? So he jumped on, both legs up in the air, which is terrifying. So now he has no way to brace himself. He has no control of the bike. Thank goodness he hits the bottom, bounces off, but is able to land it and control it. And then his response was great. He was like, saved it. And you're like, you did, but that's not the lesson to take away from this. Like, congratulating you on the save is not the philosophical point. Meanwhile, my son's at the top, and my son watches this and he's giggling because this is what we do when things get gnarly. And he says, Dad, I'm going to send it. I was like, Atticus, okay, but either send it or walk it all the way down. Do not do what your friend just did. You can't half-ass this, or what Big Daddy Kane would call half-stepping. There ain't no half-stepping in life. You either go or you don't. So my son gets on his bike at the top, and he goes, drop in, and just shoots down. And I mean, crushed it, did great, pulls out, and he's like, woo! And the thing is, it built his confidence because he had never done anything that scary. He's like, Dad, we should do this more often, which I beg him to go, but I don't want to go. So the fact that he faced that moment, navigated it, saw that hesitancy is dangerous, and then decided, he made his decision. I can't decide for him. Atticus, if you're going to do it, here's how to do it. If you're not going to do it, decide not to do it. Both are perfectly good options. He decided to do it, landed it, just as easily could have gone bad. And that's the risk. That's the point. And life is always that way, right? You do the best you can. There are no guarantees. This is why, Nathan, certainty just is not going to be something I'm ever going to say, get that back in here. Guarantees back in. Nope. I think those are idols and dangerous, and we should avoid them.
Kind of that whole episode reminds me of how the German poet and philosopher Jean Gebser, who's not as well known, he talked a lot about the etymology of the German word for origin, Ursprung. And he actually thinks that, and I'm not a linguist, but he argues that the idea of origin literally comes from this notion of the primal leap, the first step. And he actually had an episode in his own life where he had to, I think, jump into a pool of water, and he was this, very nervous, not at all athletic kind of person, and it was this kind of almost religious experience for him. And so that was kind of a event which he was faithful towards throughout his life. This idea that there are just times in life where you have to make the Pascalian wager. Like it's not ultimately you can't do all these you should think reasonably about it. You should assess your risks, but I think you're correct that there isn't it's not like using calculus to determine trajectory of a rocket. It's being able to use your bodily heuristics and able to land your bike correctly without breaking your skull.
That's exactly right. And sometimes you just don't, right? I mean, it's also important. There is no professional athlete, and my goodness, I am certainly not one of them, but there is no professional athlete who has not had more injuries than most of us could tolerate. there is no mountain biker who's been biking for any degree of time who hasn't gotten injured. I mean, it's not an if, it's a when. There's no surfer who hasn't wiped out in ways that have probably landed them with concussions. I mean, this is just part of what that involves. Similarly, there is no life lived that is not going to be marked at some point by grief, by loss, by temptations to despair. It's the scars that we carry on our body, literally, from activities, are not fundamentally different from the scars that become the experiences that inform our perspectival take on reality. Like, I tell people sometimes that it's important to understand your perspective doesn't change whether an argument is sound or not. Your experiences don't make something valid, but boy, your life and your experiences and your background certainly make that argument possible as a lived practice or not. And so it's not like I want to suggest that philosophers not ignore hardcore logic chopping kinds of work. Like, again, we're pros and we should do that kind of technical work, but it's super important that we also invite people to realize that many times the lived dynamics of risk are things that translate as what becomes an option for us. And so, like when Victoria talked about, having lost trust or lost faith, or how do we find ourselves, that person will probably relate to my use of the term faithfulness differently. Like, I recognize that it will come across differently. I had a woman reach out to me recently who said, loved the book. You talk about what you should have done different and stuff. That triggers me. It's horrifying to me. That introduces shame. And I said, I'm so sorry. My goodness, that was not what I was trying to do. But I'm still going to use the word should, because I actually think should is an existential reminder that things could have been different. Contingency's real. And so let's try to live lives where we did the best we can, even if we realize that, shoot, I should have done it different, but I don't feel bad about that. I did the best I could, right? So I'm trying to say I'm using it differently than you take it, but I fully appreciate that your experience, your background makes those sentences hard because they are interpreted in different ways. But this is going to be true no matter what words that we use. So we should try our best to hit our audience where they are, but also realize that sometimes the scars that we carry make some things impossible. I mean, my goodness, I cannot drive over big bridges because I'm terrified of heights. Like, that's a scar in my soul. Not that anything bad happened. I just can't do it. And so you do not want to ride over a big bridge with me, because I very well might take us off the edge. Not on purpose, but just because my body's going to lock. So I'll stop it before we get to it and say, hey, you mind drive us over this, Nathan? Like, because knowing where my limits are is also part of my experience that allows me to go forward.
There are two comments in the chat. First one is, this conversation reminds me of the movie documentary called Charge on Amazon. Definitely suggested. We should all check that out. And I don't know if this is the final question, but maybe as we kind of wrap things up. This is from Nick Z. What is the number one nuance of Kierkegaard's thought versus predecessor ethic beforehand?
Well, so thank you, Victoria. I have not seen Charged. I will definitely check that out. I'm always looking for music and movie recommendations. And in fact, anybody who's listening, please go get signed up for my newsletter at jrnsimmons.com. I do a monthly newsletter where I talk about things like different music I'm listening to, or books I'm reading, or movies I'm watching, not because I have great taste, but because I think it's important that we expose each other to the more that exists. So I appreciate the recommendation. To Nick, I think that the number one thing Kierkegaard offers, which it's certainly a shift from those who immediately preceded him. I mean, it's certainly a shift from Kant and Hegel and others like this, but I would say that it is for Kierkegaard the reminder that subjectivity is a task. Selfhood is a matter of becoming a self. And this is very different than what we get from Descartes up to Kierkegaard, right? Most of those thinkers, with a couple exceptions and some nuance that we could find in, Fichte or Schelling or a few of the Romantics, whatever. But in general, I think Kierkegaard's insistence that selfhood is not something that we start with, it's something that we pursue. We become a self, is ultimately the same thing for what he calls becoming a Christian. So for him, becoming a Christian is a literal thing. It's how do we live toward the example that he finds in the absolute paradox of the God-man in Jesus. That's a perfectly reasonable option for people as an object of worship and a direction of their risk. But for me, what I want to suggest is the thing that matters more broadly is that who we are is not something that is static or finished or handed over to us. Who we are is the question, who am I becoming? And so what I try to remind people is that you are now who you're becoming. And so if you don't like who you are, you better change some stuff. And so being able to ask what's worthy of my finitude is ultimately being able to own up that I am who I'm becoming. Am I okay? Am I good with this? Am I saying yes to this? Am I living on purpose into that? Am I practicing my double strokes? Am I practicing my skinnies? Or am I somebody who is floating along with the stream, going with the success current, finding my way by not actually having to, push against the stream? That's also an option. I think that's bad faith. And I think that it's ultimately going to lead to a kind of emptiness. Success, you'll do everything you set out to do, in which case you'll realize that it's pretty empty. As again, the skateboarder Rodney Mullen says, he's like, when you become really successful, you realize how success just names hollow, boring existence. Or you don't pull it off, in which case now you live your life as the failure who never did the thing. Neither of those are particularly worth recommending, right? But faithfulness for Kierkegaard is this invitation to being invested in the self that I am becoming. And we see this then picked up in Nietzsche. We see it picked up in Dostoevsky. We see this picked up in Sartre and Heidegger and Beauvoir. I would suggest we also see it extending backwards. We see moments of this in Shakespeare's Hamlet. We see moments of this in Socrates. But we also now see important moments of this, everywhere from, again, Kendrick Lamar, who I've mentioned, all the way over to, movies and films like Memento that invite us to say, well, who are you if you weren't able to just create a successful storyline? If you don't know who you were, how do you make sense of who you're becoming? What self, what book are you writing? And so maybe a way to kind of bring this to a close, since you both have quoted some amazing things, I would add the following. And I was going to use this as an epigraph in the book. I was worried about quoting a song lyric as an epigraph because I was worried I would get sued. But this is a song that I cite and quote a bunch in the book, but again, didn't use as an epigraph because it turns out epigraphs are not covered by fair use copyright policy. But it's a song called Next Year by Donovan Woods. Highly recommend it. And here's what it says. My brother and me used to climb this tree. We were going to build a little clubhouse about 10 feet off the ground. We drew the whole thing up, needed wood and our dad's truck. But he was out of work that summer and the truck only had one gear. He said, we'll do it next year. My buddies and me, we have this dream. We're going to rent this cabin way up in Montana. We're going to fish. We had the date all picked. Then my old man got sick and the plan kind of disappeared. But we'll do it next year. And then he goes into the final verse and then the chorus. My little boy and me, we were out to eat, and he said, I can't wait till next year. When I asked him why, he said, because we're going camping. We're going to the ball game, and we'll do all them other things you said we do next year. So when is it next year? And then he finishes, my old man, he was fading fast. He said, I think I'd like to go see that Grand Canyon. So we just left, packed up the car and went. I called in sick to work. We drove till 3 a.m. There ain't no next year. Another day down, another week gone. You're always talking about tomorrow. You can't beg, steal, or borrow or make time. So you make plans and hope for the best. Life moves on so damn fast. Another 12 months flies on by, but you're still here. It's never quite next year. So for me, it's never quite next year. It is precisely what I'm hoping that Camping with Kierkegaard does for people, is it invites them to not just live in the moment. It's not really a self-help book. It's not this kind of positive psychology book. It's an existential philosophy book that involves lots of my own stories and lots of time in the outdoors. But it's really trying to say the number one thing we can learn from Kierkegaard is that you have to become a self. And if you wait till next year to become a self, you'll never, ever, ever even start. So if today you say there ain't no next year, we're going fishing today. We're going to find a way to get to that ball game. And, when he talks about his dad getting sick and he said, I'd love to see that Grand Canyon. And so he just called in sick and left. Let's go. My dad is 80. He currently has cancer. He's doing well. But that hits me so hard. The idea that, man, but am I willing to cancel the meeting to go? Whatever the go is, right? And I think that for all of us, 2 concluding thoughts. Our world is effed up because some bodies get to do that more easily than other bodies. Those who have health care, those who have time off in job, those who are salaried, those who are not gig workers. We've got to find a way to start structuring society towards justice such that called in sick and went becomes a way of living for all of us. But secondly, even if we aren't there yet, all of us in some way, to some degree, despite the exhaustion, despite the temptations to despair, despite the real crap that we engage, there still ain't no next year. Like, that's even more true. And so how is it that we can find ways to choose today to be who we hope to become? And that invitation. So what is worthy of your finitude? That's what I'm inviting people to think about in this book. I hope it helps them. I hope it speaks to them. It is not, even though written from top of a mountain, it is not a wisdom on top of the mountain, handing it down to the plebeians. This is me on top of mountains, trying to get away from the unbelievable cacophony that prevents us from being able even to hear ourselves think. This is me thinking out loud, thinking on paper, and inviting a whole bunch of people to walk and talk and hike and ride and fish with me. And if anybody finds that to be compelling, I am grateful. Thank you. Help me to get better at this. And then, wow, you have absolutely made my finitude more worthy of this investment. And so I thank both of you for all your time, all your engagement.
Or we should say thank Nick and Victoria as well. I want to end on a note of gratitude. Everyone that joins us in these conversations always brings wonderful insights. I really appreciate everyone's perspectives here. So thank you, everyone, for once again making this an amazing conversation. And thank you, Dr. Simmons, for once again occasioning such a wonderful conversation.
It was my thrill. I will encourage people. Camping with Kierkegaard available on Amazon, available on bookshop.org. If you don't like supporting Amazon, you can also go to my website, jaronsimmons.com, get signed up for my monthly newsletter, check out my YouTube channel, Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, which does weekly 5 to 10 minute videos that help us think about how to put these ideas into practice on the trails of life. And if anybody wants to reach me, my email is just simmonsphilosopher@gmail.com. I would love to hear from people. I would love to answer any questions I can, or even just hear responses or encouragement that, might help me to navigate some particularly gnarly stuff. So thank you all so much. I'm a huge fan of Lawn Chair Philosophy. Anything I can ever do to support your work, I'm certainly down.
And vice versa. Thank you, everyone.